single pony walked down a road in the early morning light. The sun's rays were filtered through the thick layer of heavy black clouds that loomed above. The pony who walked wore a hooded shirt with no sleeves that went back, almost covering his cutie mark. On top of the gray-brown jacket he wore a dark-colored leather vest that bore many pockets, hiding away several items, keepsakes, and objects the pony deemed lucky. At the top of the vest, right at the base of his neck, was a large metal hook. Attached to it on one side was a compound bow, and on the other side clung a black quiver that carried several different types of arrows. Some could be lit aflame, some were blunt points, a few had small water balloons for their tips, and there were also a couple of regular arrows. Attached to the pony's flank were saddlebags, one on either side of him strapped with leather and a buckle. Under each of the saddlebags was a dagger, hidden away inside of their sheaths. The pony's cutie mark, mostly hidden by his outfit, was a bow and 2 arrows arranged almost like a skull and crossbones. On all 4 of his hooves he wore soft-covered boots, held on with 2 buckles that helped hide his hoofprints and clopping on any type of ground. The pony himself had a golden-brown coat with a darker-colored socks and snout. His mane was very short, white with black sides, and a single stripe horizontally through his short white tail. It was the stallion Pickpocket, with the ever-constant rat companion. They were on their way home. The stallion had his hood up, and he wished he didn't have to leave his cloak behind to the bush, knowing any pony would know what he was if any amount of light hit his coat. The 2 were just outside of Canchalot, a smaller settlement that housed only the poor, sick, or dying. All manner of pests, scum, or poor were thrown outside the massive walls of the upkeep city, and left to fend for themselves. There were no guard ponies here, no slavers lived here, and no pony that wished ill on others. The ponies here were forced to depend on each other to scrape out a life for themselves out of Canchalot's garbage and leftovers. The stallion knew that no pony here was a threat to him, at least no pony that lived here. Outsiders often visited cities such as this one, slavers and mercenaries looking to round up some new crop for potential customers. Judging by the calmness of the early morning, there was no threat to the townsfolk here aside from the stranger himself. The stallion looked around his surroundings and observed as he walked. The houses here were crudely built, but the ponies that lived in them called them home. A few of the buildings were made of hardened mud or manure, most of which were either poorly built or falling apart. Some were built out of sticks and straws or large pieces of garbage. Quite a few of the houses were decorated with trinkets, trash-built art, or string lights to try and make their home look less depressing to the eye. The ponies here were mostly very thin and very tired. Most had their ears down in a melancholy look, and their coats were rotting with fungus and falling out. There were fleas and biting insects everywhere. Even the young colts and fillies were thin and looked like they had given up on life. Very few were actually playing. At the sight of a stranger walking through the town, its residents became wide-eyed, frightened for their lives, and hid away in the closest house they could find. No pony actually claimed any of the shelters. What they owned was very little and could be carried. The only ponies that didn't react were the ones that were scattered through the city who were ill with the deadly plague. The sick and dying were extremely common in these parts of Equestria. Medical ponies were few and far between, not to mention they usually charged at least a foreleg and a hind leg to even look at you, and double it for any medications. Any doctor ponies that helped the poor were considered foolish with the bit inflation, or were seen as the type to lose their patients to the cold, bony hooves of death, so they weren't allowed to work on the important, wealthy folk. The ponies in this town did try to keep the dead off the streets as best they could, though. Massive graves were dug on the outskirts of town where the bodies of the fallen ponies were disposed of. The dirty sewage water that flowed out of the great city's drains was all the ponies on the outside had to drink. Though it kept them hydrated, the bacteria-filled water did nothing to help the poor ponies' health in any other way. Here and there were single-crop plants with mostly brown leaves. A pathetic tomato plant here, a withered corn stalk there. This place was truly rotted away, eaten by the war and all it had to offer the citizens of Equestria. The stranger walked through the town, continuing into his new destination, when he was suddenly stopped in his track. A pink female earth pony with a white mane and tail covered in scars, along with the familiar mark of a slave on her flank, walked up to the stallion. She didn't have a cutie mark, but she did have 2 very young fillies hiding behind her. She tried to speak, but was already regretting her decision to talk with the stranger. She looked behind herself to her 2 frightened daughters. The older one was a yellow Pegasus with a mane that looked as if it was once white, but was now caked in mud, blood, and a few other dried liquids. The younger one was a dirty purple with some form of rainbow colors in her mane and tail. The children and their mother looked no better than the rest of the town, filthy, starving, and covered in parasites. The stallion blinked, backed up a step, and paused for just another second before walking around the unhealthy ponies. Summoning up the courage to ask for the sake of her children, the mother turned to the stranger. "Please?" she asked softly. "Please, sir, could you spare some food? Even crumbs will do. It's for my girls. They haven't eaten in days." Though her foals were very thin, the mother herself was just skin and bones, practically a walking skeleton. The stallion glanced back to the mare's children before continuing on his way. He hated children, couldn't stand the little monsters. Their big eyes, begging, always getting into things they should really keep their little hooves out of, and worst of all, they're always the ones who ask the most awkward of questions.
Just keep walking,
he thought. He didn't have any food on him anyways, and the sight of them was just... Seeing that her mother wasn't getting any response from the stranger, the older of the two fillies ran to the stallion and grabbed onto one of his saddlebags.
"Please, mister,"
she begged him, hoping he had some kind of food to spare for her little sister. Her big yellow eyes were staring at him pleadingly. Weak from malnutrition, the little filly didn't have enough strength to stop the stranger, but she had disturbed the items in his saddlebags. Being quite full of stolen goods, the filly had accidentally knocked a small charm out of the side of the lid. Unfortunately, the only thing holding the bags closed was a single sewn-on button. The charm fell to the ground with a soft clang as it unsettled the dirt below it. The stallion stopped in his tracks and looked back. The filly was admiring the trinket. The casing that the gems were in was pure gold, and it wrapped around a brilliant sapphire carved into the shape of a unicorn. Its eyes and nose were made of tiny diamonds, along with a diamond necklace and crown that the unicorn wore. There was a hole at the top, as if it was supposed to be worn on a string. The stallion's eyes grew wide as he saw the filly reach for it.
"Wow, it's so pretty,"
she said, picking up the charm.
"No,"
the stallion said.
"Don't touch that! It's mine!"
He rushed over to the filly and grabbed it out of her hoof. He then proceeded to rub what minuscule amount of dirt the item had gotten off onto his vest. The filly flinched back before looking guiltily.
"I'm sorry, sir. It was just so pretty, and..."
As the filly spoke, she noticed a little black rodent crawl out of the stranger's hood to see what all the noise was for. It was Thief. The filly's eyes grew wide as she screamed and ran back to her mother and sister as fast as she could.
He's got it!"
She continued to ramble on to her mother as her feet danced around, not wanting to stay in place. "What's wrong, sweetie?" the skinny mare asked concerningly.
"A rat!"
she said as the words finally came to her. When the fillies rang through the silent town, whispers and gasps could be heard all around, along with the slamming of doors. The mother took her fillies and ran away from the stallion as fast as she could, while the stallion put the trinket back in his saddlebag. The plague. Every pony knew they came from the black rats that roamed Equestria. They fed on the corpses of the dead and became infected themselves, helping to spread the sickness to even the Empire's darkest of corners. The pickpocket looked in the direction the ponies ran and gave a snort. He knew differently than they did, and no matter any pony's opinion, it wouldn't change how he felt about his friends. He then continued on his way, picking up his pace a bit. He wanted to get out of this town, if you could call it a town, before any pony else decided to beg him for something. Another distraction. As he trotted through the town and its dilapidated buildings, something grabbed the pony's hind hoof. Almost tripping, he stopped himself and looked back to see who was holding his hind leg. It was a bat pony. Her coat was light tan in color, with a bright blue-colored mane and tail, though the majority of her fur and hair had fallen out. The membrane between her wings' fingers was the same brilliant color blue. She was covered in open wounds and bubbled sores. Her left eye was crusted over with a sickly yellow-colored ooze that dripped down her face. Hundreds of the common biting bugs were crawling all over her, not to mention the dozens of flies buzzing around her wounds. Another reminder of the plague that eerily haunts Equestria. This pony was very ill and dying. The stallion knew he could catch the plague if this pony did not let go. He pulled his hoof away and took a couple steps forward before looking back to her, his ears down. He hated feeling sorry for other ponies. He knew he wasn't going to help them. There wasn't anything he could do for her. Even if there was, he wasn't going to lift a hoof to help. He had to look out for himself. But this pony, this bat pony, reminded him of some pony he knew long ago. The sickly pony's eyes grew wide as her body convulsed. She gasped for air several times before she drew a long, painful last breath and became very still. The stallion stared and shook his tail before continuing on. The Great Down Trot was what this long and harsh era of Equestria's history was known as. The rich prosper and the poor suffer. There was little to no in between, and if you were in that middle class, in that rare division, you wouldn't be there for long. Many of the ponies knew that you had to look out for number one, or you found yourself in a slave cage along with your friends, especially if you did odd jobs like the stallion did. Mercenaries and freelancers could not trust anyone. Your so-called friend could sell you out in a matter of seconds if they were greedier than you were. Those ponies who participated in such acts had to be careful at what jobs they took, who they took the jobs from, and if they revealed themselves to their clients or not. This particular stallion had his own way of communicating with his clients that not many knew of. As the stallion reached the last residence to the town, he smiled, knowing the way home wasn't much farther. His ears twitched as he heard a little squeak coming from behind him. He stopped in place and turned around. A white rat with a metal necklace ran up to him and stopped. Happy to see another one of his friends, he petted her and picked her up. Sitting down, he took his other hoof and opened a small compartment on the rat's collar to reveal a folded-up piece of paper. The stallion took the paper, slid it into one of the many pockets on his vest, and closed the compartment on the rat's collar.
Thank you, Winter,
he said to the rat before setting her down. He watched as she scampered away back into the city of Canterlot. The stallion continued along the cobblestone lane path until he reached a fork in the road. One way headed east and the other south. A tall stick stuck out of the ground, separating the two paths. It had two signs, one pointing in each direction. The one pointing to the east said, "Unicorns only, or be shackled." The one to the south was scratched out so badly that no pony who didn't see the sign before could tell what it used to be. Now it only had red paint in the shape of skull and crossbones. The path leading east looked much more maintained, cleaner, but still looked used. The path to the south was cracked, broken, and grown over with long-grown foliage. The stallion took the southern path. He came upon a large barrier that blocked the road, a tall stone wedge withered with time and taken over by the plants around it. Old paint could be seen on the stone. Some pony had written phrases such as "condemned" or "beware, death." There was also a few old posters with hazard symbols on it and some "keep out" signs. The area was littered with warnings. He walked over to a tree on the right that had a rope hanging down from one of its branches and grabbed hold. He climbed up the branch with ease and jumped to the top of the stone block. On the other side for about a quarter of a mile were many pony bodies, either rotting away or already turned to bone, strapped in various vehicles, their deceased families inside of whatever they were pulling when they were alive. The stallion jumped down on top of the roof of a small caravan and again down to the pavement. He began walking, passing dilapidated wagons, carts, and other abandoned modes of transportation. He paid the dead no mind, nor did he give any respect, stepping on whatever corpse or bone lay in his path and crushing it beneath his hooves. As he continued, he came to the edge of a small but once elegant town, the majority of its previous residents being of high class. They had dressed up their buildings with murals and marble carvings. Most were of unicorns, their heads held high in a familiar caption that read either "Glory," "Power," or "Might." He didn't stop to admire any of the artwork. He had seen it all before, just as a majority of the equestrian population. After turning a few street corners, he came upon a very tall building, the bell tower. It was 4 stories high, and if one were standing at its highest level, they could see the entirety of the small town. The entrance was turned to rubble with the collapse of another building, and there were no windows within reach of pony hooves. The stallion walked around to the side of the building where an empty canal with nothing but decaying bodies and rubbish was built. He trotted down a broken wooden board to the bottom of the drained canal and looked to its side. The wall of the canal that was directly under the bell tower had fallen down, the edges charred, and any plant life was burnt black. He walked over to the hole and went inside. A mound of dirt from the exploded wall helped him get to the ground floor of the bell tower. Inside there was a wooden floor, covered in a thick layer of dust. A small table sat to one side of the room, and on top of it were many books and scrolls, most of which hadn't been touched in years. In one corner of the room was a pile of moldy straw and garbage. A few books were on the floor, some open and the pages stained or torn. A few empty bottles were scattered around the floor, and on the opposite wall of the original door was a staircase leading to the second story. After walking up the last step, he reached his final destination, the second floor. This room was a bit more cleaned up, though it had a lot of stuff ponies would consider junk lining its walls and floor. 3 desks were in this room. only one of which wasn't littered with paintings, coins, or leather bags filled with random contents. The cleaner desk had several leather straps, a pair of pliers, several bits of string, and sticks. Attached to the ceiling was a large fish net that held up even more items the pony considered being priceless artifacts. Several large hooks held on by metal chains also dangled down within hoof's reach. Many of them were holding on to pouches or quivers containing items to make more of the pony's specialized arrows. Another set of stairs was across the way from the first set, and a large open window next to the less cluttered table let the stallion see out to the path he had taken to get to his home. The stallion unlatched his saddlebags and set them on one of the tables before unclipping his bow and quiver, hanging those on two of the empty ceiling hooks. Then he took the note out of his front pocket and put it on the table by the window. He took his hood off of his head, and Thief sniffed about. She knew she was home. As he reached for the saddlebags, Thief climbed down his arm and onto the table before scurrying out of sight. The stallion began to pull items out of the saddlebags and place them in the large pile of items. The charm that had fallen into the dirt he set aside by itself. The strange rocks he had gotten from the mansion slave barn he left in the bag. He walked over to the table by the window, grabbed a soft cloth before retrieving the trinket and starting to clean it up. Once the items shined to the stallion's satisfaction, he walked over to the next set of stairs and onto the third floor of the bell tower. The old wooden floor of the third level creaked and groaned with the moving weight of the stallion on top of it. Across the room were neatly organized treasures. The walls of the room were covered in several different colors of silky fabrics lined with golden stitching and dotted with gemstone buttons or diamond-decorated embroidery. In one corner of the room a giant pile that was stacked almost to the roof was hundreds of neatly arranged towers of bits. Various golden statues were aligned by how much the ponies saw as their value, the cheaper ones in the front and the most treasured in the back. Framed paintings stood on end in 3 long lines, boxed in by 3 wooden boards nailed together to prevent them from falling. Many trinkets, necklaces, and charms that were shined to perfection were hanging from long rods that were crudely shoved into the wall of the room. A table above the statue held several short vertical sticks. Each had 5 elegant-looking rings on them. The trinket he had brought upstairs he carefully hung on one of the rods that was dug into the wall with all the others, aligned perfectly on the hook. He stopped and admired his collection, everything in its proper place, and everything as shiny as it could be. Not a speck of dust or bit of garbage in this room. But what was in this room wasn't enough. He had to have more. A lot more. Returning downstairs to the room filled with random objects that needed sorting, he went to the now much lighter saddlebags and pulled out the shard. He examined them closer than he had a few hours ago. They were very shiny, tinted blue, and looked as if they were broken off of something bigger. There were 6 pieces in total, and 2 fit together as if they were puzzle pieces, and the rest of the puzzle was missing. Not wanting to misplace these special objects, he took them upstairs and carefully aligned them inside of an empty golden box that was decorated with all assortments of gemstones. He didn't know what the blue crystals were for, but he had a feeling they were worth more than the stack of bits he had that was aching the old wooden floor. He looked up and stared at a string hanging down from the ceiling. He took a hoof to it and pulled it down, revealing a staircase built into the floor of the 4th level. He trotted up to it. The final level of the bell tower was a wide open platform with very short walls that weren't even up to the stallion's knees. 4 thick and sturdy beams shot up from the corners of the building that held up the final roof, an arrowhead-shaped dome with a large chain that dangled down from its center. The final link of the chain was broken off, and its massive bell lay on the floor, a bed of strong cloth inside of it, and a very torn cloth hung down from the top of the bell's opening to act as a wind barrier. Outside of the bell was a small hole-filled crate. A cloth covered the top of it and held a book and a halfway used candle on top. The stallion walked out to the edge of the tower and looked out. He could see the entire city from where he stood. Each broken stone path that led out of the city was blocked with the same heavy stone walls that prevented its citizens from escaping whatever horror led to their doom. Nothing in the barren city stirred. The stallion in the bell tower was the only pony to call this once expanding city his home. He didn't know what had exterminated its dwellers, and he really didn't care. He just loved how no one would steal what he had rightfully stolen. This was his town, his castle, and his throne. His subjects are the wild animals that make nests in the broken buildings, and the dozens of rats that assist him in his heists. This was his life, and he was happy with it. The stallion gave a sigh before walking to the bed in the bell. Before entering it, he took his vest off and set it down on the floor next to the crate. Pushing aside the torn cloth, he entered the fallen bell, laid down in the straw bed, and began to fall asleep. With the evening setting of the sun, the stallion's eyes began to open. He lifted his head and gave a yawn before shaking it from side to side to wake himself up. He looked out toward the torn cloth, and through its holes he could see a faint light peeking through the still looming dank and heavy clouds. He could hear the pitter-patter of rain on the roof of the bell tower and smiled. He loved it when it rained. It always put him in a good mood. He stood up and curled his back in a stretch before walking out of the rusted metal mouth. The chilled air kissed his fur and he shivered. He picked up his vest in his mouth and walked downstairs. Once he was on the second floor, he put his vest on and walked over to one of the piles on a table. He reached his hoof in, which was then consumed by the various items, before grabbing something and pulling it out. It was a brown glass bottle with a torn label. He twisted its bottle cap and opened the beverage. The faint smell of alcohol wafted out from the container. He took a swig before walking over to the less cluttered table and setting it down. The Stein opened a drawer on the desk that had several sharp-pointed pieces of steel, and took 6 of them out. Another drawer on the desk carried various lengths of a thin but strong rope. He took 6 of these too. After setting those on the table's top, he counted 6 sticks that were already on the top and put them in the same pile. He walked over to one of the cluttered desks and opened its drawers, retrieving a hoofful of feathers. After having all the supplies he needed, he began to make some rope arrows. Once he was finished, he chugged what little there was left of his beer. He took his quiver down from where he had hung it that morning and looked inside, making sure he had a satisfactory amount of everything else. He put the new rope arrows inside and clipped it onto his vest. He took his compound bow down and attached that on the other side. He then grabbed the empty saddlebags and wrapped them around his backside, clipping the buckle in the front. The stallion looked around the room, searching for something else. He looked under the desks, sifted through the piles of items, and began to search the other floors.
Thief!
He called out.
Thief, where are you?
After being unsuccessful on the first, second, and third floors, he went up to the fourth. Looking around, he didn't see his little friend anywhere. He moved the torn cloth on the bell and looked inside.
Thief, are you in here?
He asked, his voice echoing in the large metal pot. A black ball of fur lifted its head and looked to the stallion. She yawned and stretched before sitting up. The stallion gave a warm smile at her before saying,
There you are. Come on. Time to go see what we can get our hooves on today.
The rat ran over to her master and climbed up, burying herself in his hood. He trotted down the stairs, but stopped at the second floor again. The note. He had almost forgotten about it. He looked over to the table and was glad that it hadn't blown away with the wind of the storm. The stallion walked over to the stable and picked up the piece of folded paper, sat down on the floor and opened it. Hey, Cloud, it's me. Your shipment is ready for you to pick up if you're not Dragon Shower and Slaver Hooves yet. I really wish you wouldn't use these vermin to communicate. People are starting to avoid my shop because they think the rats are bringing the plague in. Oh, and my brother wanted to have a word with you when you get the chance. Later. The signature was an unreadable scribble, but Clout knew who it was from. He folded the letter back up and stuck it in one of the bags hanging down from the roof before continuing down the stairs and back to the evergreen forest.